So first of all, congratulations to many of you on being admitted to UCSB, and welcome to any prospective students that we also might have in the room. My name is Professor Melody Jue, and I've been faculty in the English department for the last 10 years, and I regularly teach classes in environmental literature, ocean literature, science fiction, and next quarter science fiction short stories. My research is in the ocean humanities, a broad interdisciplinary field that's allowed me to bridge my interests in literature, science, and the arts. Additionally, my research draws on the experiences of scuba diving as a first-person observation mode and means of interpreting underwater sites. When I was an undergraduate at UC Davis, I did not know that this kind of research was possible, but what I've learned is that studying literatures in English, or in my case, environmental narrative, can connect to almost anything in the world. And one of the biggest shifts I've noticed from high school to college was finding out that studying narrative doesn't always mean studying printed books or novels. Instead, it can also mean looking at how narratives circulate in popular media, in science writing, in nature documentaries, and more. And the Department of English at UC Santa Barbara is a great home for this kind of interdisciplinary work, which you can check out just by looking at our interesting Spring 2026 course titles or looking at student work, literary magazine, The Catalyst, or seeing what kinds of honors projects students have pursued. Okay. Um, so for my talk today, I'll share part of my recent book, Coralations. The book was published just last year with Minnesota Press, and it's open access. So if you find yourself curious to read more about this one example of what research in English can look like, you're welcome to read it for free online. And the story begins with a story about color. Okay. So Pantone 161546 Living Coral is an orangish pink hue that was chosen as Pantone's color of the year in 2019. Pantone describes living coral as vivifying and effervescent and evocative of how coral reefs provide shelter to a diverse kaleidoscope of color. This description channels the common imaginary of coral as a rainbow signifier of tropical marine life. Yet Pantone writes that coral reefs shelter color instead of fish or even other reef life forms. As a company that provides a universal language of color for use in industry and design, it's not surprising to see Pantone mobilize an ecological metaphor to talk about a diversity of color as if colors themselves were life forms to be conserved. So the color that we see here, living coral, is a metonym on two levels, a color that stands in for a rainbow of other coral colors and an iconic coral that stands in for a multiplicity of other corals. It offers an occasion to consider the deeper effects of a kind of homogeneous narrative of coral and its implications for how we think about environmental narratives broadly, scientific knowledge, and mediation. And metonymy, the act of referring to something via one of its parts or attributes, is often about substitution. So, for example, invoking the stage to indicate theater. But living coral, so although living coral masquerades as a metonym for all corals, it actually references one very particular coral, and that is Corallium rubrum or red coral, which has been harvested from the Mediterranean since antiquity and valued as a type of gemstone. So in this scary face you see here, you might recognize the decapitated Medusa's head, which in Greek mythology was imagined to drip blood into the ocean, which then hardened into this type of red coral. Sometimes referred to as red gold, Corallium rubrum ranges from a sort of pale pink color to dark red and is in danger of disappearing from the Mediterranean due to overharvesting, habitat destruction, and climate change. What is commonly understood as the generic or universal color of coral is actually indexed then to this very particular type of coral rather than other possible corals, which could be brown, purple, black, or other. Yet the environments of living corals are losing their very conditions of livability. And when I drafted this in 2023, the world's oceans were experiencing one of the hottest summers on living record. And actually, this is of note because in 2026, right now, we're about to experience another very large marine heat wave off the coast of California. And so it's no surprise then that the reception of Pantone's living coral as a color has been mixed. As one journalist wrote, it, quote, feels like a troll directed at a planet rapidly growing inhospitable to the many organisms that call it home. So I see the metonymic quality or even iconicity of living coral as a problem to the extent that it directs attention in the sciences, humanities, and global environmentalisms mostly to just one type of coral and one type of environment, and that is warm tropical reefs of stony corals. But this includes a number of exceptions. Not all corals build reefs. There's these beautiful soft corals in places like Fiji that live in warm waters and come in all kinds of pastels. Cold water corals in the deep ocean do not have symbiotic algae because they live in places that are very dark and lack sunlight. Um, and one example is Lophilia pertusa, which I'll talk about more today. This isn't the image in the bottom right corner, which is a sort of ghostly or ceramic white. And then there's also fire corals, which are stinging to the touch further away on the coral family tree from the stony corals that have become so iconic. Joining them are whip corals, mushroom-shaped purple sea pansies, sea pens, and other octocorals that build life worlds far different from tropical stony corals. So there's living coral, and then all of these other corals, corals that inhabit different ecologies, but also that lead to different environmental narratives. And to put this in literary terms, I'll say they're different protagonists. Now, in the book Coral Empire, Underwater Oceans, Colonial Tropics, and Visual Modernity, art historian Anne Elias cautions that in the early 20th century, photographers tended to treat coral as this sort of colorful and exotic other to promote a sort of a homogeneous view of the tropics, often mixing up the Caribbean and Australia as the same thing. Troubling the boundaries between animal, vegetable, and mineral, corals are scientifically described as colonial organisms, as these sort of colonies of tiny polyps that slowly build calcium carbonate skeletons and live with their symbiotic algae. But corals are also icons of precarity. They're in danger of bleaching when the oceans become too warm, causing them to eject their symbiotic algae and turn bone white. An iconic sense of coral lends itself to certain kinds of media analogies, to photography and also to books. And in my longer study, I show how these analogies turn out to be not so universal when you change the protagonist from a kind of sort of normative sense of coral in the tropics to other types of corals. So for example, like terrestrial trees, stony corals tend to possess growth rings that accrete over time. And they build up in this way like books, mortared in place through the secretions of living polyps. And in the documentary Chasing Coral from Netflix, which was a sequel to the documentary Chasing Ice, there's this real sort of pervasive narrative thread throughout the documentary that analogizes corals to a kind of library of the climate. But of course, not every coral does this kind of thing. Soft corals are soft. They don't build stratigraphic layers or appear to be book-like. And instead, when they die, they just melt into seawater as ephemeral as the petals of a flower. If not all corals are like books, then we might ask, how effective are conservation narratives that use the book as an analogy, taking disappearing reefs as akin to losing a library? What kind of environmental narratives change or emerge when the protagonist does not just default to the typical type of reef building coral, but switches to a different one? So the word correlation, which sounds like correlation, right, to connect two things together, uh, is something I chose for my book, but is also not the first instance of this particular type of pun. It's independently occurred to many people and could be a portmanteau of coral and correlation or coral and relation together. For example, the nonprofit organization Coralations was founded in 1995, focusing on Puerto Rico and the wider Caribbean. And in the image here, you can see a still from Nicholas Magnan's film Coralations, which dwells with an archive of coral core samples, that's a tongue twister, at the Australian Institute of Marine Sciences Coral Core Facility, and dwells with the specter of impending coral death that is connected. The film visually plays with how scientists use UV lighting to detect correlations between coral growth bands and environmental damages or changes. Another example would be Iris Braverman's beautiful essay called Coralations Returning to Breath, which contemplates, quote, the vibrant interrelations among various coral parts, as well as between corals and other living beings, such as their algae. Now, these all exist already, but my book aims to be a little bit different in its aspiration not only to trace correlations, but to think about how they break or how weird and unusual corals break different kinds of correlations we've come, break the kinds of things we've come to associate with coral. So I look for weird corals that challenge stereotypes about coral with maybe a capital C, building up pictures of other possible relations to be addressed. So as two examples, I'm going to read from a couple different chapters from my book for this short talk. And the first one is going to be chapter 3 on coldness, and we'll see how a deep sea coral changes a certain kind of environmental narrative. Cold water corals, sometimes called deep water corals, offer the surprise of thriving in non-tropical habitats, since nearly all global maps of corals and coral textbooks tend to focus on tropical corals. The massive Allen Coral Atlas, for example, purports to map the world's coral reefs, yet includes data on tropical corals alone. One deep sea biologist with whom I spoke said that he had never been asked to peer review any tropical coral research, but his warm water coral colleagues regularly peer reviewed his. So it's perhaps unsurprising then that the humanities have followed in suit and focused book-length studies almost exclusively on warm water stony corals, whether this includes their mediations, their endangerment, or their symbiotic relations. So we can ask the question, what kinds of narrative expectations do cold water corals break, and what kind of new correlations might they put into perspective? And I'll pause here to say that the idea for this book originated from these texts already being on my bookshelf, and then me thinking about a summer lecture that I was going to give and realizing like, wait, I haven't written about corals yet. Like, what's going on in the coral literature in the humanities, which includes anthropology, art history, uh, and more. And it turns out that most of these tend to focus on warm water corals. So I thought, okay, here's the gap. So while many species of cold water corals exist throughout the world, one widespread species in the Atlantic is Lophilia pertusa. Lophilia is found as shallow as 200 feet under the ocean in the cold waters off the coast of Norway, as well as thousands of feet deep in the Gulf of Mexico and off the continental shelf of West Africa. Geographically, one of the largest reefs of Lophilia is Ross Reef off the coast of Norway. And unlike tropical corals that live close to the surface and bright sunlight, deep water environments preferred by these type of corals are quite dark. Acclimated to an environment without sun, Lophilia is azooxanthellate or existing without symbiotic algae, whose metabolism plays on sunlight. Susan Milius playfully calls this corals without borders, a homophonic pun, of course, on borders. And due to its lack of zooxanthellae, Lophilia is nearly colorless, taking its name from lophos or tuft and helios or sun to describe the bright white tufted polyps that adorn its branches, feeding by grasping particles of food that float by in the water column. Thus, one key correlation that Lophilia breaks is the way that coral is always connected with symbiosis in a kind of common environmental narrative. Because of the way that Lophilia deviates from dominant correlations with symbiotic algae, sunlight, color, and tropicality, it was described by one textbook as, quote, the coral that breaks all the rules. And it's wonderfully weird. Now, one implication of deviating from expectations of symbiosis is that Lophilia exists in different relations to the ocean as a visual and a sonic medium. Whereas tropical corals lend themselves to photographic analogies, cold water corals do not. Consider the way that art historian Anne Elias, reflecting on the early 20th century photography of John Williamson and Frank Hurley, describes the way that both corals and photographic practices rely on light. Okay, so I'm going to read this passage you see here. A thoroughly modern relationship developed between photography and filmmaking, coral reefs, and tropical water, one based on the common ingredient of light and the material quality of transparency. It became apparent that there was a magical correspondence in the way that natural phenomena of corals and the technological processes of photographs both required light for photochemical reactions. It was a revelation that corals, as well as photographs, needed light to bring them to life and enable development. Now, here the word development suggests something biological and photographic, enabling an easy relation between developing an image and developing as a life form. And there's another place in Coral Empire where Elias makes a nice analogy actually between the transparency of this clear tropical seawater and the lens of a camera as both these kind of clear substances that enable just a little bit of magnification. Now, in the case of tropical coral, symbiotic algae are the plants that are photosensitive to light and assist in the growth and metabolism of the coral. Now, stories about Lophilia suggest a different relation to glass compared with the tropics through sound rather than sight. And the story I'm about to tell you here is actually from a science textbook. And this might seem weird for an English professor to be interested in, but it turns out that there's a lot of great stories and ways you can read these through a literary lens. So I'm going to show the sort of gem that I found within this one. So this book, Deepwater Coral Reefs by engineer and marine geologist Martin Hovland, uh, ended up being a great resource for a particular particular moment. So Hovland recounts a memory from a cruise in July 1982 when, as an employee of the Norwegian company Statoil, he was mapping the seafloor aboard a ship called the Master Surveyor for a future oil pipeline off the coast of Norway. Through the use of side-scan sonar, Hovland noticed an unusual cone-shaped structure on the seafloor hundreds of meters below. He directed the crew to use a gravity core to sample the site. The passage here reads, "Soon the core hovered at 260 meters depth, right above the top of the unidentified strange cone. Suddenly, the core was dropped until the wire went slack. As it winched in, excitement rose. Most of us expected just another sticky clay core, but we had luck, and a sigh of astonishment went around as several pieces of white coral bits fell tinkling onto the steel deck. It sounded like bits of glass falling." So now let's pause for a moment and close read the literary qualities of this passage. Although the first description of Lophilia is visual, describing white coral bits that fell, the analogy to glass emphasizes its acoustic properties rather than its visual clarity. Lophilia here is sensed through almost a musical register, echoing through contact with the steel floor of the petroleum survey ship. Whereas visuality is primary in assessing tropical coral reefs, sound is the medium that allows surveyors to detect cold water corals through sonar thousands of feet deep. So we see the sound sort of invoked then on both this personal scale with the bits of glass falling onto the deck of the ship, as well as sonar being used to identify where this reef might be in the first place. Now, whereas tropical reefs might occur places you would consider a vacation destination, deepwater corals like Lophilia happen to thrive in places with high degrees of oil extraction, the North Atlantic, the Gulf of Mexico, and the western coast of Africa. Off the coast of Norway, one system of 9 live reefs, the oldest of which was 8,000 years old, was even named after an oil pipeline and became called Halton Pipe Reef Cluster. We can trace other material correlations between Lophilia and petroleum extraction in the art installation Coral Forest, commissioned for the 2021 Helsinki Biennial in Finland, and this is made entirely of yarn. Coral Forest was an iteration of Christine and Margaret Wertheim's ongoing project, the hyperbolic crochet coral reef. The reef celebrates similarities in form between ocean organisms and crocheted shapes, which both embody the mathematics of non-Euclidean geometry inspired by mathematician Dinah Taimina. And this is a fancy way of saying that crocheted shapes have a lot of frilled edges and wavy shapes that are easy to achieve through crochet, but are harder to mathematically model. While the initial reefs were crocheted by the Wertheim sisters, satellite reefs have involved thousands of participants from around the world. Over 3,000 Finnish people participated in this particular Helsinki reef. As environmental scholar Heather Davis writes, this collaborative process is one in which, quote, each person becomes part of a wider whole analogous to an individual core polyp, engaging with a slow process of building a collective form. Here, community and individual agency are activated, mirroring the formation of living reefs that also grow in relation to their local conditions. While the Helsinki coral forest may not evoke Specifically, cold water corals like Lophilia, it doesn't exactly represent warm water corals either. The corals in the art installation are much more fantastic as crocheters evolve and even fabricate new forms. We might see the Helsinki coral forest as precisely such a fabrication rather than a representation of corals, and therefore uncorrelated from the species that make their waters in the cold waters of the North Atlantic, like Lophilia. However, if we think of fabrication in terms of the materials used, it's also significant that the Helsinki reef was made entirely from repurposed plastics. And I hope you can see this in the detailed, sort of zoomed in image here. The corals took on fantastical colors and forms, including highlights of printer's ink and bluish violet, from upcycled strips of plastic left over from everything from toilet paper packaging to zip ties and other materials. In several corals, bands of white and purple spiral across crenellated forms, along with an anemone-like creature with lime green zip ties for tentacles. The shine on the reef belies its plastic form across so many crevices created by the crochet stitches. Of course, if you go to any craft store, many new yarns are also made of plastic through acrylic or polyester blends. And so to crochet a reef out of these reused plastic strips formally echoes the following correlation between the location of Lophilia reefs, maybe, and petroleum infrastructures. However, climate change amplifies other correlations between corals and oil extraction. During the unusually hot and rainy summer of 2021, the plastic reef took a turn for the worse. The artists write, quote, "On Vallisari, the island where the artworks were displayed, the bunkers became infested with mold. Video screens dripped with slime, projectors burnt out. But for the corals, a more permanent tragedy ensued. Blobs of mold blossomed on the pedestals and on the understructures holding up the works." So, in other words, even plastic sea creatures in this art installation were ruined by one of the unseasonably warm heat waves intensified by global carbon emissions. The correlation between Scandinavian reefs and oil extraction thus remains coincident in both living corals and even these artistic abstract forms, Lophilia pertusa and hyperbolic crochet, each under threat of unraveling. Okay, so that's from chapter 3, and then the next short section I'm going to read is from chapter 5 on the topic of optimization. And this chapter is going to talk about some more citizen science material, but it's also going to get into one of my favorite short stories. Okay, so optimization. One of the most common modes of surveying coral reefs is through taking high-resolution photographs and digitally stitching them into a larger photomosaic. This method of surveying has much higher resolution than taking a single photograph, and the resulting abstractions look a bit like the pattern of camouflage in rainbow-colored hues and are made ready for computational analysis through the careful preparation of hand tracing corals. The challenge with this type of photomosaic survey is, how do you count all the corals? What to do with the massive survey data, which can number in the millions of photographs? One gamified solution to this backlog of uncategorized coral photomosaics is the NASA-funded project NemoNet, a quote, single-player iPad game where players help NASA identify coral reefs by painting 2D and 3D images of coral. Because the process of hand-identifying corals is typically slow and laborious, players, who are interpolated as citizen scientists, are invited to collectively participate in the work. Whereas some institutions collect photographs via diver surveys, NASA acquired the images of coral through drones and satellites, assisted by an algorithm called fluid lensing, which edits away the distortions of seawater in order to view coral reefs clearly, mathematically erasing the opacity of the ocean and turning it into something like air. The images in the database of NemoNet are not so much about immersing humans in underwater worlds then, as they are about bringing underwater corals into the aerial world of human beings, a precondition for their surveil and classification. NemoNet represents a new subject of correlation, the algorithm. As players progress through the game, identifying corals, their actions contribute to teaching a neural network how to better identify thousands of photographic images of the coral reef. Quote, data from the NemoNet game is fed to NASA NemoNet, the first neural multimodal observation and training network for global coral reef assessment, unquote. So here, the algorithm is basically a student trained to make more accurate correlations between photographic objects and particular species of coral, and thus assist in establishing baseline estimates of coral populations around the world. The process of training the algorithm to make accurate correlations is, therefore, a project of optimization, developing a tool to increase the speed of image processing and ensure that such processing is accurate. However, there are other correlations with AI optimization tools, including AI that takes inspiration from Coral as an iconic or model form. Google Coral advertises itself as a complete toolkit to build things with local AI, offering a variety of services: object detection, pose estimation, image segmentation, and key phase detection. Its logo, which you see on the right, evokes both the shape of a branching coral and a circuit board, with a circle at the end of each growth tip in a color that, not surprisingly, is just a touch more orange than Pantone 161546 Living Coral, which I began my talk with. And like Pantone, Google Coral is selective about its similarities to living corals. It imagines itself as optimistic, buoyant, and even a utopian tool for smart cities. Now, here's where I put on my literary hat and notice that when AI is compared to coral, it's about building networks and optimizing the speed and efficiency of business at a local level. However, coral is not invoked as a model for its connections to global environmental mortality, events, or coral bleaching, or other kinds of threats and vulnerabilities to coral. So coral's very, very selectively invoked as a figure here. But corals can also interrupt dreams of optimization, or at least prompt us to ask, optimization for whom? Now, to address this question, I turn to author Ken Liu's science fiction short story, Dispatches from the Cradle, 48 Hours on the Sea of Massachusetts, which imagines a post-Diluvian, or after the flood, future where much of Earth's affluent population has fled off-world to colonies in the rest of the solar system, leaving behind a far hotter and storm-ravaged Earth. You can read the story for free on Lightspeed magazine online, there's an image on the right, but it's also part of multiple anthologies, including Drowned Worlds, edited by Jonathan Strahan. So to go back to the story, the people who stayed on Earth by choice or by circumstance lead either underground or archipelagic lives. They shelter from the inhospitable Earth through climate-controlled architectures, such as bubbles that can submerge to ride out the worst storms. The story takes the form of a feature article told by an unnamed journalist who incorporates fragments from the fictional memoirs of a curiously Thoreau-like character who goes by the name Asa Whale Tongue Pie, and whale and tongue are both emojis, actually, a former managing director with the fictional company J.P. Morgan Credit Suisse on Valentina's station Venus. Asa is introduced here as a figure of optimization. She's described as a skilled negotiator at the height of her career, enacting a vision to return Earth to an optimally habitable climate. Yet she becomes the subject of fascination when, one day, she quits her job as the youngest managing director of her company, divorces her many husbands and wives, liquidates her assets, and returns to live on Earth, buying a standard survival habitat kit identical to the millions used by refugee communities all over the planet. And she describes it as setting herself afloat like a piece of driftwood. Whereas many science fiction stories ask the question, is it ethical to terraform planet, fill in the blank? Dispatches from the Cradle asks, how ethical is it to want to terraform Earth back to a previous temperate state after the ravages of climate change? Dispatches raises the important question then of climate optimization for whom, a question that comes to concern corals and coral-like communities. In one scene, Asa takes the visiting journalist to a notable colony of underwater corals growing in what's now called the Sea of Massachusetts, an area covering over Harvard University's Widener Library with a, quote, massive brain-shaped coral formation whose gyri and lobes evoke the wisdom of generations of robed scholars who had once strolled through this hallowed temple of knowledge. Consider how this passage dramatizes a type of Shakespearean sea change, a famous phrase used in The Tempest, Act 1, Scene 2, not of bones turned into coral as in Ariel's song, but of the coral reef as a living media form that actually surpasses the book. The intricate crimson folds of the brain coral echo the form of the human brain, but also are the form that survives after the library has been flooded. The reef in Dispatches embodies a type of specialized knowledge that is particular to these newly evolved corals, knowledge of how to thrive in the conditions of what Bill McKibben would call Earth, EAARTH, our planet made alien and unrecognizable due to the intensifications of climate change. In Asa's fictional memoir Adrift, which we get splices of sort of throughout the short story, Asa recalls how corals had unexpectedly, quote, developed new symbiotic relationships with artificial nanoplate secreting algae engineered by humans for ocean mining, and even acquired their pigments, such as Harvard crimson, from heavy metals and pollutants left on Earth. At Widener Library, the corals are particularly bright, quote, because this area was touched by the hand of mankind the longest. Beautiful as they are, these corals are incredibly fragile. A global cooling by more than a degree or two would kill them. They survived climate change once by a miracle. Can they do it again? She asks, if Earth were to be re-terraformed back to a state we might recognize. So for Asa, corals interrupt the fantasy of re-terraforming Earth for which she had once fought. She now worries about how the desire to change Earth back would impact the surviving human communities and corals once it makes possible the recolonization of Earth by off-worlders. So rather than making algorithms in the image of corals or using algorithms to classify large data sets of coral images, this short story shows how corals might prompt the critical question, who is optimization for in the first place? Who does it benefit and who does it exclude? So my hope for this short book, which again is open access on Minnesota Press, is that it refreshes curiosity about particular corals rather than assuming that all corals share the same story. I've talked about how deep water corals like Lophilia pertusa present different correlations from tropical corals, leading us to think about connections to sensing via sound rather than sight, and to connections with the oil industry. I've also talked about how corals have been used as models for optimization, but how Ken Liu's science fiction short story gives an example of how corals can pose the question, optimal climate for whom? In all these cases, corals are wonderful species to think with that have the capacity to defamiliarize our expectations about how environmental narratives work or what they look like. So my strategy in this short book has been to shift the protagonist from tropical corals to cold water corals or these other science fictional corals and see what changes. In this way, weird corals can be helpful in opening up new kinds of environmental narratives that might have the capacity to generate surprise with a broader public. Rather than repeating the same stories about coral, we can look to unusual coral protagonists to turn our attention to new stories that might capture attention differently. Okay, so that's it for my talk. Thank you very much, and I am happy to take any questions during the Q&A period.
Thank you so much, Professor Jue. And as folks are percolating over the information that was shared and thinking about their questions that they'd like to ask, I'll remind everyone that you can use the Q&A at the bottom of your screen to ask that question. You could also use the raise hand feature if you'd like to go ahead and unmute to ask your question. Again, this session will be recorded. So for the purpose of the Q&A, I'm going to go ahead and stop the recording. But